You were never meant to hear this story. And yet, now that you're here, there is no turning back. Imagine this: Richmond, Virginia. Winter of 1851. Snow clings to the cracked cobblestones, muffling the sound of carriage wheels in the dark. The doors of the Medical College of Virginia swing open, and two identical men step inside. Twins, wealthy, educated, the heirs of one of the state's most powerful families. But they are not here for pride or prestige. They are here because something inside their minds has begun to rot, something they cannot name but which no prayer, no physician, and no power of money can seem to silence. 6 months later, both men will be dead. One will claw himself raw, tearing his own flesh until nothing but ribbons of skin remain beneath his broken nails. The other will dissolve into silence, motionless, staring into emptiness until his body wastes away. The official reports claimed hereditary weakness, polite term for madness. But polite terms are often masks, and in this case, the mask was hiding something unspeakable. Because when colleagues attempted to review the Henderson case files, they discovered an anomaly more terrifying than disease itself. Every record, every chart, every line of evidence had been altered, falsified, or destroyed. Not misplaced, obliterated with surgical precision. As though someone knew what the twins had experienced and wanted it erased from history forever. And then came the disappearance. Their attending physician, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, left Richmond within 72 hours of the twins' final breath. He did not resign, did not announce departure, did not even settle his accounts. He simply vanished, leaving behind fragments of coded journals that spoke of experiments no institution wanted revealed. Those notes, though never fully deciphered, hinted at something far older than psychiatry, older than Virginia, older than science itself. A method of breaking human will, of splitting the mind, of using twins as instruments for knowledge not meant for man. The decision was made. The medical establishment buried the truth. Better to sacrifice two brothers than let the public see how fragile the boundaries of medicine and morality had become. But silence, my friend, is never neutral. Silence spreads, festers, and 174 years later, the shadow of the Henderson twins still waits to be unearthed. Tonight, you will hear what was not meant to be told. And once you know it, you will never look at science or power or your own mind in the same way again. To understand how Thomas and Timothy Henderson reached the halls of that medical college broken, desperate, and doomed, you must go back not to Richmond, but to the land that birthed them. 12 miles east of the city, the Henderson plantation sprawled across 800 acres of Virginia's richest soil. The red earth clung to boots like blood, and locals whispered that you could plant a broken branch in that dirt and wake to find it sprouting leaves by morning. Fertile land, profitable land. But beneath its surface, something darker pulsed, something that had nothing to do with crops. Jeremiah Henderson, their father, built his fortune not just on tobacco, but on bodies. He learned early that Southern medical schools were starved for specimens, the sanitized word used to cloak what they truly craved. Human cadavers for dissection, bones for study, living flesh for experimentation. And Jeremiah provided. At first, he sold the bodies of enslaved workers who died of disease or age. But soon he discovered that a man could profit far more when death was not natural. Runaways were fabricated on paper, ledger entries forged. Those who grew too old to labor, those who resisted, those who simply knew too much vanished. Their bodies ended up under the knives of Richmond's young doctors, stripped of humanity, reduced to anatomy. This is the empire Thomas and Timothy were born into in 1825, during a storm so violent it tore down barns and killed horses. Lightning carved the sky as two brothers emerged, identical, destined to inherit not just wealth, but a legacy of moral corruption so complete it had already begun to stain their bloodline. They were raised not with the innocence of children but with the calculations of merchants. By 12, they had witnessed murder disguised as medicine. By 15, they were assisting in preparations, cleaning instruments slick with blood, recording results of poisonings in neat, careful handwriting. By 20, they were no longer mere apprentices but heirs cold, sharp, conditioned to see men and women as currency for science's forbidden hunger. And this is where you must pause, not in comfort, but in unease. Because the Hendersons were not alone. They were one family in a network, plantation owners, physicians, academics who all shared a single obsession. How far can human beings be pushed, dissected, manipulated before their minds shatter? The twins would not only inherit that question, they would become its answer. Twins, identical in bone, in blood, in the cold shade of their gray eyes. And yet, the Henderson brothers were not mirrors of each other so much as two halves of a single, darker whole. Thomas, the elder by 7 minutes, was the fire. His cruelty burned hot, deliberate, calculated. As a boy, he killed animals with the precision of a surgeon, writing down each heartbeat, each gasp, as though the suffering of a stray dog or a barn cat was no different from the crop yield of a tobacco field. Rage lived in him, but never wild. His anger was controlled, sharpened into an instrument. He struck when it mattered most, and he struck to leave marks that lasted. Timothy was the opposite. Ice, not fire. Quiet where his brother was loud. Still where Thomas moved. And it was Timothy's silence that unsettled people most. He would stare at a servant, at a tutor, at even his own father, with eyes that seemed to reach inside a man and strip him down to nothing. Where Thomas tested pain through action, Timothy tested dominance through absence, proving that sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. People began to avoid his gaze, whispering that he saw through skin into something the rest of them could not. Jeremiah Henderson nurtured these differences as a gardener nurtures separate plants in the same soil. To Thomas, he fed violence, encouraging his experiments on animals, even rewarding them with money, as though cruelty were labor worth paying for. To Timothy, he fed secrecy, teaching him codes, ciphers, the art of writing truths in ways only select eyes could ever decode. By adolescence, the twins had become instruments of their father's will, and their minds were no longer their own. But there is something more dangerous than cruelty or silence. It is when cruelty and silence combine. The Henderson brothers were not rivals, not competitors. They were collaborators. One punished with fire, the other froze with silence. Together, they created an atmosphere so suffocating that even seasoned overseers trembled in their presence. By the time they reached their 20s, they were feared not only by the enslaved laborers but by the very physicians who purchased bodies from their father. The twins had learned the most sinister lesson of all. Knowledge and power mean nothing unless you can bend human beings to your will. This was not mere childhood. This was apprenticeship into a system that sought to master not just the body, but the soul itself. And it was only the beginning. By the spring of 1850, Richmond was changing. The Old South still clung to its traditions, but behind the doors of the Egyptian building on Marshall Street, another South was taking shoppy South, obsessed with science, with progress, with stripping away skin and sanctity alike in the pursuit of knowledge. The Medical College of Virginia was the crucible of this obsession. Its halls smelled not of tobacco or wood smoke, but of ether, decay, and chalk. Behind its columns, physicians spoke of advancement, with the same fervor preachers used when speaking of salvation. But where religion claimed souls, medicine here claimed bodies. The Henderson twins arrived not as students, but as something far more valuable. Suppliers, heirs to a family pipeline that fed the college's insatiable appetite for subjects. Their father's ledger entries matched with professors' requests. A diseased lung, a strong heart, a body still warm. Jeremiah Henderson delivered. But Thomas and Timothy didn't just deliver, they observed. They watched young surgeons slice through flesh like farmers husking corn. They listened to professors discuss not just anatomy, but behavioral breakdowns, psychological elasticity, and the malleability of identity. This was not medicine as cure. It was medicine as control. For the first time, the twins were not confined to the plantation's shadows. They stood in a theater where men in pressed coats and polished boots applauded dissection as though it were art. Here, Thomas's fascination with controlled violence was not condemned, it was encouraged. Here, Timothy's cold silence was not feared, it was admired, mistaken for composure, for intellect. The institution validated what the plantation had planted. But there was something more. Among the professors was Cornelius Hartwell, a man whose reputation had begun to spread like wildfire. He spoke not of flesh and bone, but of the mind. He believed madness was not random but structured, that identity itself could be bent, reshaped, even broken into pieces that could be studied like organs in a jar. To most, he was eccentric. To the Henderson twins, he was revelation. Their first brush with Hartwell was not in lecture but in experiment. A subject brought in a man still breathing, restrained, trembling. Thomas leaned forward, studying the tremors, noting the sweat. Timothy did not move, but his eyes locked on the man's face, watching the spirit retreat beneath the weight of fear. Hartwell noticed. He always noticed. And in that moment, a door opened between the Hendersons and the world of forbidden science, a door that, once crossed, could never be closed again. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell was not like the others. Where most physicians obsessed over the body, Hartwell obsessed over what the body concealed. The mind, the spirit, the unseen engine that made men act, obey, resist, collapse. His colleagues whispered that he carried strange notebooks bound in black leather, filled not with anatomy sketches but with codes, symbols, diagrams of human behavior written in a language no one else could decipher. He spoke rarely in public lectures, but in private he drew disciples. And among them, none listened more intently than the Henderson twins. Thomas admired the way Hartwell treated suffering not as tragedy but as data. To him, agony was an instrument and Hartwell knew how to play it. Timothy admired something different: the silence, the methodical restraint with which Hartwell described horrors in calm, almost tender tones. Hartwell spoke to them not as boys, not even as men, but as apprentices destined for a greater purpose. In his presence they felt chosen. The bond deepened in hidden chambers, not the public lecture halls but locked rooms beneath the Egyptian building, where gas lamps flickered against walls stained with substances no one dared name. Here, Hartwell tested not diseases but thresholds. Subjects, men, women, sometimes even children were brought in, and Hartwell would expose them to sensory deprivation, to induced terrors, to substances that blurred the line between dream and waking. He was not searching for cure. He was mapping the collapse of the human psyche. Thomas recorded results with clinical precision, as if carving cruelty into scripture. Timothy watched the silences between screams, noting how identity itself dissolved under pressure. Together, they became Hartwell's favored pair, his eyes and ears, his heirs to knowledge so volatile it could never appear in print. Hartwell began entrusting them with fragments of his coded journals, challenging Timothy to decipher, urging Thomas to test. He saw in them not just students but continuity. But mentorship is never neutral. Hartwell did not merely instruct. He infected. He whispered to them that the mind was clay, that personality was nothing but layers of habit and fear, that even the strongest man could be shattered and reshaped like a vessel dropped and glued again. The Henderson twins believed him. More than that, they hungered to prove him right. What they did not realize was this: the moment you treat the mind as an object to be broken, you place your own mind on the altar too. And Hartwell, in his silence, was already preparing them for that sacrifice. There is a moment when the witness becomes the hand. When the observer, safe behind glass, realizes the glass is gone and the bloodstains are his own. For Thomas and Timothy Henderson, that moment came in the winter of 1850, in a chamber lit by a single lamp whose glow barely reached the corners of the stone room beneath the Egyptian building. A man sat chained to a chair, trembling, his wrists rubbed raw by iron cuffs. Hartwell stood behind them, his voice calm, clinical, almost kind. "We do not study death," he told the twins. "Death is silence, and silence teaches nothing. We study the breaking, the moment when a man ceases to be himself. That is where truth lives." Then he handed Thomas the scalpel. Thomas felt the weight of it, colder than iron, sharper than anything he had held on the plantation. The man begged in whispers, his words crumbling into stammers. Hartwell nodded once. Thomas pressed the blade against flesh, not to kill, not to mutilate, but to test. A shallow cut, a recording of the scream, the blood flow, the eyes widening as though the soul itself had been touched. Timothy leaned forward, silent, watching the fear bloom, calculating how long it took for the voice to crack, for the man to surrender. Night after night, the rituals deepened. Hartwell devised sensory tests. Blindness induced with cloth soaked in unknown solutions, sound deprived in chambers where silence became a weapon, thoughts distorted by powders slipped under the tongue. The twins administered them, documented them, refined them. What had once been horror became routine. What had once been routine became hunger. Soon, Hartwell trusted them enough to run sessions without his presence. Thomas experimenting with controlled pain, Timothy manipulating silence and suggestion. Together, they learned how easily identity dissolved when pressure mounted. How a man could be convinced he was no longer himself. How a mind could fracture, split, retreat. They began to believe they were not destroying but creating, shaping the raw clay of human consciousness into whatever form they desired. But here lies the paradox of power. The deeper they pressed into other minds, the less they noticed the fractures forming in their own. Hartwell had not given them tools. He had given them mirrors, and every cut, every silence, every scream reflected back upon them, etching cracks that neither brother could yet see but which would soon consume them both. Richmond whispered of advancement, but Henrico County knew the truth. Science costs money, and money in Virginia flowed from the soil. Tobacco was the mask, but the Henderson fortune came from bodies. By 1850, Jeremiah Henderson's ledgers told a story darker than any crop. Payments from the Medical College of Virginia were neatly disguised as agricultural consultation, livestock supply, even construction services. But the numbers did not lie. The Henderson plantation had become the silent artery through which flesh was converted into profit and profit into progress. And the college was not the only beneficiary. Hartwell's chambers, hidden beneath the Egyptian building, required more than academic funds could provide. Instruments, chemicals, restraints, powders imported from Europe, all expensive, all discreetly billed to Henderson accounts. Jeremiah wrote the checks, Thomas and Timothy delivered the subjects, and Hartwell conducted the studies. The plantation had evolved from fields of tobacco into a factory of silence, producing not just corpses but data, not just bodies but broken identities. At first, Jeremiah believed he was merely supplying science, selling what others dared not. But Hartwell saw further. He knew the plantation was the perfect mask. Enslaved men and women disappeared every month across Virginia, their absences explained away as escape, disease, or sale. Who would question if a few more vanished under Henderson control? And who would trace those vanishings to rooms where physicians in crisp coats applauded the progress of medicine? So it was that the twins found themselves at the nexus of two empires, the old empire of land and chains, and the new empire of science and control. The plantation's profits paid for Hartwell's powders, for scalpels so sharp they split hair, for ledgers written in cipher. And the more Jeremiah invested, the more he pulled his sons into the role of guarantors, not just heirs of wealth, but custodians of the secret commerce between the dead soil of Virginia and the dark laboratories of Richmond. It is here the true corruption emerges. Not in isolated experiments, not in one physician's madness, but in a system willing to bury morality beneath profit. The Henderson twins were not aberrations. They were the inevitable offspring of two colliding worlds, slavery and science, each devouring the human body for its own ends. And their minds would become the battleground where that unholy alliance left its deepest scars. At first, the Henderson twins believed they were untouched by what they inflicted. They were the hands, not the subject, the observers, not the broken. But the mind is a treacherous mirror, and cruelty reflects back on the wielder more surely than blood stains a blade. Thomas noticed it first in his dreams. Not nightmares, dreams of order, of numbers, of charts. He would wake at night scribbling results in his notebook, results of experiments that had never happened. He began to measure time not in days or seasons, but in the intervals between screams. Even when the plantation was silent, even when the fields stretched calm beneath the moon, he swore he could still hear echoes beneath the earth, low cries carried through the soil. Timothy's fracture was different. Where Thomas's mind burned with restless calculation, Timothy's turned hollow. He began to lose sense of presence. He would sit at supper, staring at his reflection in the silver cutlery, whispering under his breath as if testing different tones, different identities. Servants noticed him pausing in hallways, watching them with that gray-eyed silence until they stammered, "Yes, sir," and hurried away. But what chilled them was not his stare, it was that sometimes he seemed not to recognize them at all. As if the man looking out of Timothy's eyes was not Timothy at all. Hartwell encouraged these fractures. "Observe yourselves," he urged. "The experiment is not only out there, it is within." His words were meant as instruction, but they landed as seeds, and the twins became their own soil. Thomas began to push harder, not just testing subjects but testing himself, pressing blades against his own skin, holding fire near his flesh to measure his own thresholds. Timothy sank deeper into silence, recording entire days in ciphered journals that even he sometimes could not decipher when he returned to them. Slowly, their bond once seamless took on shadows. Thomas, fiery, began to grow impatient with Timothy's long silences. Timothy, icy, began to view Thomas's violence as reckless, unsophisticated. They did not yet hate each other, but the first threads of division had been pulled, and once a thread is loose, the fabric cannot remain whole. This was the hidden cost of Hartwell's mentorship. To fracture others, you must first fracture yourself. The Henderson twins were no longer apprentices. They were becoming subjects, though neither could yet see that their descent had already begun. The Henderson twins had always moved as one-two halves of a single will, indistinguishable in stride and in speech. But by 1852, those who lived under their roof began to sense something shifting. It was in the pauses, the way Thomas would speak quickly, only for Timothy to cut him off with a long silence that carried more weight than words. The way their eyes, once mirrors, now lingered too long on each other, searching for fractures they both felt but dared not name. The experiments sharpened these differences. Thomas grew impatient with restraint, hungry for escalation. He demanded quicker results, harsher methods. Subjects pushed past limits Hartwell had set. Timothy, colder, quieter, began to withhold. He watched, took notes, but offered no suggestions. It was as if he were studying Thomas as carefully as he once studied Hartwell's procedures. One evening, in the cellar beneath the plantation house, the fault line opened. A subject had convulsed under chemical exposure, lungs rattling with every forced breath. Thomas pressed forward, eager to push further, but Timothy stepped between, hand on his brother's wrist. "Stop! It isn't finished. It's already finished." The silence that followed carried more danger than any blade. For the first time, Thomas did not yield. His hand twitched, still holding the vial, and Timothy did not flinch. The subject's wheezing filled the gap until, finally, Thomas laughed short, sharp, mirthless. He set the vial down. But when he looked at his brother, there was no recognition of kinship. Only the faintest flicker of suspicion. After that night, their bond no longer felt like symmetry, felt like surveillance. Thomas measured Timothy's silences as if they were judgments. Timothy read Thomas's every motion as a warning of instability. They were no longer two halves of a whole. They were mirrors, each watching the other for the first crack, each half convinced that only one of them would emerge intact. And Hartwell, ever the conductor, watched with satisfaction. He said nothing of their tension, but he began leaving notes, small puzzles, encrypted fragments of theory that he knew each brother would interpret differently. It was not yet the journals, not yet the full descent, but the seed of division had been planted, and Hartwell watered it with silence. Hartwell never spoke of the journals aloud. They appeared one by one, slid across the laboratory table like offerings, the ink still damp, the bindings worn as if handled by many unseen hands. No index, no dates, no clear sequence. Each volume was a puzzle of diagrams, equations, and phrases written in a cipher that twisted Latin into hieroglyph, medicine into mysticism. The first pages seemed almost coherent anatomical sketches layered with careful measurements, notes on pulse, temperature, chemical reactions. But turn a few leaves and order dissolved. Lines blurred into circles, diagrams of organs gave way to maps of stars. Words repeated themselves in spirals. Identity through rupture, the vessel is not the self, twins are proof of the fracture of God. To Thomas, the journals spoke of expansion. He lingered on the pages where Hartwell sketched muscles drawn tighter, lungs trained to endure smoke, eyes widened to absorb more light. He began to believe the journals were instructions for surpassing the human frame keys to remaking the body into something beyond suffering. Thomas read them as prophecy. That pain was not an end but a ladder. Timothy saw something else. His eyes always returned to the margins, where Hartwell scrawled fragments of scripture warped into riddles. Two cannot remain as one. The double is a prison. For Timothy, the journals were not about the body at all, but about the self, its fragility, its multiplicity. He began to believe the true experiment was not on flesh but on the soul, and that his own reflection was proof that the self could split, fracture, and be remade. By candlelight they sat, each with a different volume, each convinced he understood what the other could not. When Thomas spoke of strength, Timothy countered with silence, scribbling codes no one else could read. When Timothy whispered of identity as an illusion, Thomas scoffed, demanding results measured in blood and breath. Neither realized they were no longer reading the same texts. They were reading themselves, and the journals were only mirrors angled toward madness. Hartwell watched without interference. Perhaps he had written the journals precisely to be misread, to ensure the brothers' unity dissolved under the weight of interpretation. Perhaps he believed truth was only revealed when minds broke under the attempt to grasp it. Or perhaps he too was lost in the maze he had drawn, unable to tell where medicine ended and scripture began. What is certain is this. By 1853, the Henderson twins no longer needed Hartwell to fracture them. His journals had become their gospel. Each brother preached a different faith, both written in the same hand, both spiraling toward the same abyss. They lived beneath the same roof, but from this point forward, they no longer read Hartwell's journals as brothers. They read them as rivals, two prophets claiming the same scripture, yet speaking different tongues. Where the code spoke of flesh, Thomas lingered. Where it whispered of consciousness, Timothy brooded. And though they rarely named the divide aloud, the walls of the Henderson house began to ring with two sermons. Thomas was the prophet of body. He believed Hartwell's fragments had revealed a new covenant of transformation through pain. To him, the body was clay, and agony was the sculptor's hand. He paced the plantation like a preacher, quoting lines from the journals as though they were commandments. The flesh is the gateway, the marrow the key. He began to test thresholds, pushing men and women past endurance not merely for cruelty, but to see whether pain could unlock something hidden. He forced servants to hold burning irons, to endure long hours without sleep, to suffer incisions that he swore revealed the body's secret map. To his warped eyes, suffering wasn't destruction, it was revelation. Every scream confirmed his doctrine. Every body that broke before his gaze was, in his mind, a failed disciple. Timothy, by contrast, became the priest of fracture. His scripture was quieter, subtler, and infinitely more terrifying. Where Thomas sought to master flesh, Timothy sought to dismantle the mind itself. He claimed Hartwell's encrypted musings proved that selfhood was an illusion, a veil stretched too thin across infinite void. His experiments took the form of whispers in the dark, confessions coaxed from captives, lies introduced until the victim no longer knew their own memories. He would isolate them for days, stripping away familiar sounds, stripping away their names, until they could not tell whether the words leaving their mouths were their own or planted by him. He called it unveiling. Those who survived were hollow, gazes emptied of will, puppets who had once been people. And Timothy would sit with them in silence, staring into eyes that reflected nothing back, convinced he had peeled away the illusion to reveal the abyss beneath. Two sermons, one of flesh, one of soul, one taught through screams, the other through silence. And though they never argued openly, the Henderson household had become a cathedral split in two, each twin officiating his own black mass. Their followers, the enslaved, the subjects, the disposable lives caught in the grip of power, were the congregation. and they learned that survival now depended not on obedience, but on discerning which gospel their master served. The plantation had always been a place of toil and control, but under the twins' new doctrines, it transformed into something else entirely, a crucible. The fields no longer grew only tobacco. They grew evidence, ritual, and sacrifice. To outsiders, the Henderson estate looked unchanged. Smoke rising from chimneys, wagons moving down dirt roads, overseers pacing with whips. But inside the mansion, in the barns converted into laboratories, in the sheds sealed tight with iron locks, the air thickened with a new theology. Thomas's gospel of flesh demanded demonstration. He no longer tested the limits of the body in private. He staged them as ordeals. Entire groups of captives were lined in rows, each forced to endure a different punishment as he took meticulous notes. Fire pressed to skin, bones stressed until they cracked, wounds deliberately left unhealed. To him, these weren't cruelties, they were data points, verses in a scripture that only he could read. He would raise Hartwell's coded pages in one hand like a holy text, declaring, "The marrow holds the secret fire," before plunging a blade into a man's thigh, digging until white bone gleamed. To the enslaved, Thomas was no longer just master. He was tormentor priest, using their bodies as altars. Timothy's doctrine of the soul spread quieter but cut deeper. He turned the old smokehouse into what he called the chamber of unveiling. Subjects were not beaten, but broken differently. Kept in silence, starved of human contact, confronted with contradictory stories until their minds collapsed under doubt. He whispered Hartwell's words in their ears, not as commands but as riddles. What if your name is not your own? What if the one who remembers is not the one who lives? Days later, captives would emerge, unrecognizable, eyes vacant, speech fragmented, unable to distinguish dream from reality. Timothy considered these husks proof of his success. He would write their names in a private ledger, then cross them out with a single slash of ink, announcing, "Another veil removed." What had begun as a plantation built on exploitation had become a theater of doctrines. Overseers spoke in hushed tones of Brother Thomas's trials and Brother Timothy's unveilings. Even those who wielded the whip now trembled, unsure whether their loyalty would save them or only make them the next subject. And beneath it all, Hartwell's coded journals guided the way. Each phrase, each half-deciphered symbol, became justification for atrocity. Flesh and mind were no longer sacred, they were texts to be rewritten. And the Henderson estate, hidden by the Virginia hills, had become a seminary of horror, birthing knowledge no institution dared acknowledge. Whispers are harder to bury than bodies. By the spring of 1851, the Henderson estate radiated unease beyond its borders. Richmond was not blind. Wagons rattled through town at odd hours, bearing covered crates that smelled faintly of blood and lime. Students at the Medical College of Virginia traded rumors in taverns, rumors of unrecorded cadavers, of experiments that seemed too elaborate, too cruel to be confined to classroom study. And though the college itself benefited from Henderson shipments, there were nights when even hardened anatomists hesitated to open the crates, unsettled by the meticulous carvings in the flesh, markings that looked less like surgery and more like ritual. Local farmers noticed, too. Some swore they heard screams carried across the James River, sounds that did not belong to animals. Others whispered that the Henderson twins had made a pact with something older than medicine, older than science itself. Children in Henrico County began daring each other to walk past the plantation fence after sunset, claiming lights flickered from the barns at midnight, strange, pulsing lights like lanterns swinging in patterns too precise for accident. Inside the city, suspicion seeped into the college's faculty. Dr. Hartwell, once respected as a man of theory, was now muttered about in corridors. Professors complained of missing notes, of students being invited to private demonstrations that left them pale and sleepless. Yet when pressed, none could explain what they had seen without trembling. A dean who questioned Hartwell too forcefully was found weeks later collapsed in his study, having scribbled across his walls a single phrase repeated dozens of times. The veil must fall. The church noticed, too. Parish priests warned their congregations of unnatural pursuits, infecting the county, though few dared to speak the Henderson name from the pulpit. It was easier to hint at evil than to confront wealth and power directly. Still, mothers began keeping children indoors at night. Wives urged husbands to steer their wagons clear of Henderson land. Fear spread like humidity in the Virginia summer, thick, inescapable, clinging to every surface. And yet the twins remained untouchable. Wealth insulated them, while Hartwell's connections in Richmond shielded their dealings. Official records showed nothing unusual, just tobacco sales, property taxes, and respectable contributions to local charities. But under the polished veneer, the whispers multiplied. Every rumor was another crack in the facade, another tremor under the surface. The question was no longer if the truth would break through, but how much destruction would spill out when it did. The fracture that had been growing in silence could no longer be contained. By the summer of 1851, the Henderson mansion itself became a battlefield of sermons, Thomas and Timothy delivering their opposing gospels not to the enslaved, not to Hartwell, but to each other. Every room of that house carried their tension. The parlor reeked of Thomas's demonstrations, blood stains hidden poorly beneath rugs. The smokehouse still echoed with Timothy's whispered unveilings, prisoners muttering nonsense even after release. They did not eat together. They did not speak of brotherhood. What they shared now was two prophets fighting for the throne of one gospel. Thomas thundered. He tore Hartwell's journals apart, literally ripping pages, keeping only the passages he believed confirmed flesh as the truest scripture. He began branding his symbols into the skin of victims, creating scars he called signatures of endurance. In his view, Timothy's work was cowardice, shadows masquerading as science. "What use is the soul?" he raged. "If the body collapses, show me the marrow that does not break. Show me the heart that does not burn." His doctrine demanded spectacular ordeals that left the plantation grounds littered with broken bodies, proof of his truth carved into human form. Timothy countered with silence that cut deeper than shouting. He dismissed Thomas as a butcher, a fool blinded by blood. His own work, he insisted, revealed the higher path. He began keeping captives alive for weeks, stripping them not of flesh but of self. Some he convinced they were not who they had been, others he turned against each other with carefully planted lies. "The body dies once," he murmured to Thomas in a rare confrontation. "But the soul can be killed 1,000 times. To Timothy, his brother's gospel was crude noise. His was refinement, the art of erasing men from the inside. Hartwell watched the fracture with fascination, even delight. His coded notes grew more fevered, as if the conflict itself was the experiment he had been building toward. He began documenting not the twins' subjects but the twins themselves, measuring changes in their sleep, their speech, their tempers. To him, they were no longer heirs or assistants. They were his great test. Two identical vessels fed the same scripture, unraveling into opposite gods. But beneath the rivalry, paranoia festered. Both twins whispered that Hartwell favored the other. Both searched the coded journals for secret passages, convinced the doctor had hidden a revelation meant only for them. The house grew thick with suspicion, every silence louder than screams, every glance a weapon. And as Richmond's whispers grew into warnings, the Henderson brothers turned inward, circling each other like wolves with the same blood on their teeth. Autumn came early in 1851, and with it the Henderson house rotted from within. Servants whispered that the twins no longer slept. Doors slammed in the night, arguments erupted like thunder, and Hartwell's presence flickered between them like a shadow with no master. The journals, those pages that had once bound them, became weapons. Each claimed the other had mistranslated the code. Each accused the other of heresy. The air thickened with mistrust until the house itself seemed to lean under its weight. The collapse began with Thomas. One evening, he was found in the barn clawing at his own skin, muttering passages of Hartwell's scripture through bloodied lips. He carved symbols into his chest with broken glass, screaming that the marrow was on fire, that Hartwell had lied, that Timothy had stolen the truth. Witnesses swore he laughed even as he tore his flesh, as though he believed each wound brought him closer to revelation. His body, once so disciplined, became the battlefield of his doctrine. By dawn, he was dead, eyes wide open, jaw locked in a grotesque smile that would not close. Timothy's end came differently. He did not rage. He did not bleed. He simply stopped speaking. Days after Thomas's death, he was discovered seated in the smokehouse, staring at the wall, lips unmoving, body wasting away. When touched, he did not flinch. When spoken to, he did not reply. His breath slowed, his skin sagged, and within weeks he was gone, erased from himself, a hollowed man who had unveiled too far. Where Thomas had burned, Timothy had dissolved. And Hartwell? He vanished. 72 hours after Timothy's death, the doctor disappeared from Richmond as if he had never existed. His house stood empty, his office cleared. All that remained were fragments of notes, lines written in a code no one could break. Those who read them swore the words shifted under their gaze, diagrams bending into symbols, symbols bending into madness. The college sealed the papers away, buried the case in silence, and rewrote the story. Two brothers felled by hereditary weakness, a tragic but natural decline. But the silence was deliberate. Records were altered, witnesses disappeared, and the journals were locked in vaults no one dared to open. The choice was made: protect the reputation of medicine, or expose a truth so vile it would destroy trust forever. They chose silence. And yet silence does not bury. It festers. The Henderson Twins' fate was never era's edit waits, breathing beneath the floorboards of American history, waiting for a man like you to stumble upon it. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Now tell Mado you feel it inside you, that thin crack in the mirror of your own mind. The question you cannot unask? Comment the phrase, "The veil must fall," twice below, and step fully into the descent. Do not leave this story as a spectator. The Hendersons are not just history, they are a mirror, and now you've seen your own reflection in their descent. If you are willing to step fully across the threshold, comment the phrase, "The veil must fall." Write it twice, as the twins themselves would have, to seal your passage. Subscribe now, because what was buried here is only the first chamber. Deeper horrors remain, and you will not return the same. This channel is not just a viewing. It is an initiation, and tonight you've already begun.